just like, did you have a mentor? Did you learn from somebody? Like, why did you choose multifamily versus, say, what a lot of people do is they just go buy regular houses?
Yeah, so a couple things. So yes is a short answer on everything you're saying. I educated myself big time. So while I was in Detroit and once I kind of made that mental shift, and one thing I didn't mention was I had read Rich Dad Poor Dad years before. So when I was talking to Jack, a lot of what crystallized for me was looking at the guy who had spent 23 years of his life dedicated to this company with no plan B, looking at this other guy who already had his investments and could care less what really happened. I mean, he cared, but it wasn't going to change his life. So that took me back to Rich Dad, Poor Dad. And this was the real life manifestation of that in this corporate world. So for me, that was to say, okay, we need to be more like Jack and take advantage of investment opportunities. How do we do that? We got to educate ourselves. We got to read more books. I mentioned the Rich Dad book. He had a second book that was the ABCs of Real Estate Investing by Ken McElroy. Read that book. So I read as many books as I could read. I started to there weren't really as many RIAs, so Real Estate Investment Association meetings at that time. So I did look up some, but I couldn't find any. Podcasts weren't out yet, but I did start networking a little bit and talking to other people who I knew owned real estate. I started telling my colleagues, hey, I'm looking to invest in real estate. Do you know anybody? And they're like, oh, such and such owns a condo. Great. I'm happy to talk to her, right? And the short is everybody I talked to who did own real estate, particularly who had scaled a portfolio, they all said they wish they had started or moved to multifamily sooner. So after hearing that multiple times, I just said, okay, well, if everyone keeps telling me this, why don't we just start with multifamily? And we started small multifamily, residential, 2 to 4 units, but we started there for that reason. The other thing is once I moved to Chicago, Chicago has a plethora of 2 to 4 units. So when you're in that city, most of them are, 2 unit buildings. So it's easier to find and buy 2 to 4 units than it is to even buy a single family house, at least on the north side of Chicago where I lived.
And so that was the direction. That's how you kind of made that happen. And so tell me, I'm just kind of curious because I mean, you seem like a really intelligent dude, well spoken, and tell me a little bit about your childhood. I mean, what kind of kid were you growing up? I mean, did you come from a rich family? Did you come from, really educated parents? Were they college educated? Were you college educated? I mean, like, tell me a little bit about your childhood.
Yeah, no to everything except me being college educated. So I grew up um so my parents split when I was young. I was probably like 5 years old when they split, right? So I kind of grew up in this two different homes. I spent Monday through Friday with my mom. Friday nights my dad would pick me up and I'd spend the weekends with him. So I was blessed to have present parents even though they weren't together, but neither of them really had much money. So I learned a lot about money just from trying to figure out why we didn't have money. And I think one of the things that's always key is, you know my stepmother told me this. She said, a lot of adults spend their entire adulthood trying to fix things that happened in their childhood, right? So if you grew up and you didn't have certain things, you kind of frame up your adult life to address that. One of the things I tell people is like when you talk about success, well, success to me is defined by each and every person by themselves. And one of the ways I define success for me is about being a present father. And part of the reason I say that is I felt like I had to raise myself a lot. And it's not to say that my parents weren't there or anything, but my mom worked, there was times she worked 2 jobs. She had to do the thing. She told me very clearly what her expectations were. I knew I had to follow and meet those expectations, but that was it. I came home, I was by myself for about 3 hours every day when I came home, right? I had to cook for my sister at times. I had to do stuff. There were times my mom came home and we looked at each other and said, what's for dinner? And she was looking at me like, I was hoping you was going to figure it out, right? So I kind of learned to be independent at a fairly young age. I was a very shy kid, kind of a sick kid, went to the hospital like 50, 60 times, according to my mom. I don't believe that's true, but it has to be. She keeps telling me. But I had asthma. So I had very severe asthma at that. So I felt like I couldn't do a lot or didn't have a lot of opportunities, either financially or just because of health reasons. So I had a somewhat sheltered childhood. So as I kind of grew into my teenage years, I started really finding my independence, finding my voice, and kind of developed more of a fighting spirit. I think I always had it, but I've really identified with kind of the underdog, right? And the various stories of that and overcoming and perseverance. So for me, as I got into my teenage years, I started to understand what success was, started to look for it, started to seek it out, wanted to read biographies and watch, documentaries about success and people who are successful. And what I was looking for was trying to understand why them and why not me. And at first I thought there was a secret everyone had, right? And I will tell you, it's funny because there's only one story that I recall that I really saw someone do something that said, yeah, I would never do that. And it was Sean Combs, and it was him taking the train every day from DC to New York for an internship that was unpaid for 6 months. And I was like, yeah, he's crazy. I wouldn't do that. But everything else felt pretty practical. It was like, oh, go work out every day, or hey, go play basketball for 3 hours, or hey, I, do this. I'm like, okay, if you really wanted that, I could like, you can invest that. And it just made success more attainable to me. So I think that was the big thing. And for us, without having people went to college, my best friend, his parents went to college. So I just looked at that, like, how do they live versus maybe how I grew up. I remember asking my dad one day why he didn't read like the Wall Street Journal or watch like, CNBC and all those kind of shows. And my dad's a blue collar, hardworking American, right? He's worked in factories. He was not investing in stocks and all that stuff. And he kind of looked at me. We had a quick conversation, and I think for him, it epitomized like the difference from a generation standpoint. Like my dad's a fairly young dude, but he is definitely like that that previous generation. He is, you get a good job, you work at 30 years, you retire. Like that's his mindset. When I quit GM, he almost blew his lid, right? He was so bad and disappointed. We had conversations, but he didn't understand my vision. He didn't understand the way I viewed the world and viewed corporate America. He saw it as, you got this good job, you got good perks, you got a company car, they pay you well. Why would you quit? And he thought it was very risky for me to go out to a smaller agency and become more entrepreneurial. He called me a pencil pusher. I mean, it's just one of those things. But I think ultimately you have to have your own vision, and you got to seek it out because there's answers out there. You just have to figure out where they are and who to connect with, and you have to be willing to expand your circle.
Thank you for watching. If you like this video and you want to watch another clip, click right here. If you want to watch the entire podcast, click right here.